Hi, welcome to GPH 716 Biostatistics. As you know, this course is an important part of the curriculum, and I really just wanted to give you a very brief introduction here to it today. So I want to talk about these 5 questions. Why do you need the course? What is the course about? How much math will you actually need to know how to do in order to do well in this course? What are the assignments like, and a little bit of information about what the final project is like. Okay, so we're just going to talk about these 5 things, and hopefully by the end of the lecture you have a little bit more sense of what the course is like and where it's going. Okay, so why do you need this course? Well, beyond the fact that it may be required for you to take the course, statistics are ubiquitous, so they're everywhere. You can't open a journal article without seeing them most of the time. You can't listen to the news without hearing about them. More and more data is being collected every day. We hear all kinds of terms like big data and things like that. And so statistics have been around for a long time, and they're going to be around for even a lot longer. And it's an integral part of doing research. Okay, it's an integral part of evaluation. And these are things that you likely will be doing if you're in a public health program. Okay, so statistics are everywhere in medicine and public health, and there's just no way of avoiding them. I have good news about that, which we'll talk about later, though. So, you'll need to use them to evaluate other people's research, for example. So you will get a journal article and look at it, and I'd like you to have some sense for whether or not there are some basic things that those researchers have adhered to. So oftentimes the statistics are complicated. Other people have done the analyses, statisticians have done the analyses. And the goal of this course is not to have you understand the statistics in that much depth. The goal is simply to allow you to look at an article and see if some of the really basic things that people should be doing as part of their research they're actually doing. Okay, so you might need to do some simple analyses yourself. We're not going to do anything very complicated in this class. We're going to stick to, sort of a wide range of things, but not very deep. And that's on purpose so that you get a lot of exposure to some common things, and you get, again, some language down, especially so that you can evaluate what other people are doing and then do some very basic things yourself. And probably the most important thing, I think, on this slide is the last one that says that you really need to know when to seek help from a biostatistician. When are the analyses that you're doing, or analyses that you may be sort of evaluating, when are they too complicated? And when should you seek help? Because there are biostatisticians around, and they obviously are more than happy typically to help. And that's an integral part of sort of working as a research team. Okay, so the course itself, really, very broadly speaking, is going to cover 3 different things. It's going to talk about how to collect data, how to summarize or visualize data, so looking at graphs and tables and how to kind of summarize data sets. And then finally, how to analyze data. So we're going to talk about how to draw inferences from data. So like I said, we'll only do some sort of simple analyses, so we're only going to look at 1 or 2 variables at a time. So we're not going to have very complicated models or tests or anything like that. We're going to be looking at either 1 variable or how 2 variables are relating to each other. Okay, so that's pretty much, the limits to what we'll do in the course. Okay, the important question of how much math do I actually need to know for this course is probably one that may be causing some concern. I think it's common for people taking this course to be concerned about the content, being afraid that it's going to be very mathematical. And I have good news for you. So all you need to know how to do is add, subtract, multiply, and divide. In fact, this equation at the top of this slide here, this is math does not equal statistics, is about as complicated as we're going to get. I shouldn't say that. Maybe a little bit more complicated than that. But we're not going to do anything other than these 4 basic rules. You'll need some simple algebra skills in order to understand how to solve for things once in a while. But statistics is more about process and language, and it's more of a science than math. Statistics uses math, but it's not the same thing as math. Okay, so statisticians and mathematicians are 2 entirely different groups of people, and we're going to be focused more on logic and reasoning and, like I said, language than we are how to do something very complicated mathematically. Okay, so you don't need to have any anxiety about that. We will be using software in this course. The really tedious calculations will be done for us by the software. Okay, so very, very tedious calculations that a long, long time ago you would have to do by hand. We no longer have to do that, and nobody does that. Everybody uses software. So we will have that to help us along as well. Okay, the assignments in this course can kind of be broken down into these different types of assignments. One is the discussion boards. So most weeks you'll have discussion boards and you will be asked to respond to a question and often to respond to your classmates' responses to the same question. And you just want to make sure that when you're doing those discussion boards, you're putting effort into them. So don't give a one sentence answer as a response to somebody else's discussion board. Actually give it some thought and give some constructive response back. So the discussion boards are a great way for you to interact with your classmates. You learn a lot from your classmates during courses like this, and I monitor those discussion boards. Your teaching facilitator will also be monitoring your discussion boards, and you'll be able to get feedback from them when you're doing those. Written assignments are kind of sporadic throughout the course, and the written assignments, you want to make sure you pay attention to what the requirements are for those. So each one of these types of assignments has a rubric. You want to look at that rubric, understand the rubric, and as long as you adhere to that, that's how we're going to grade these assignments, is by going through that rubric and looking for each one of those elements. Okay, there is one quiz that's in this course. That quiz is more heavily focused on the textbook than these other assignments are. It's an open book quiz, so you don't have to memorize anything, of course. You have free access to the book, and you'll be able to actually use software, on that quiz too, if you would like. So the quiz is sort of the most kind of mathy part of it, I guess you could say. If I'm looking at these 4 points, that's probably how I would describe that one. But the last part to these assignments is the final project. The final project I will talk a little bit more about here in a minute and go through that with you. The final project really begins now. Okay, so you really need to start thinking about your final project right now. And again, as we go through the course, you'll be doing pieces of that as part of the written assignments, for example, a lot of the time, and even, parts of that go into the discussion board. So the good news is, by the time that final assignment, that final project is due, you'll actually be able to go back and pull a lot of information that you've already gathered, and a lot of the things that you've already done will go into that. Okay, so it shouldn't be too burdensome by the time the end of the course gets here. Okay, so that's really what I wanted to talk about with the assignments. I do want to show you the final project document here. So this final project document gives you the breakdown of how this final project will be graded and what the steps are that you need to take in order to complete it. When you actually turn the final project in, it will consist of a few pieces. So it will have an introduction, and we've described for you here what that introduction should be like and how long it should be. The methods that describe where your data came from, how it was collected. You're going to come up with some research questions that you would like to answer with your data, and you'll talk about the methods that you use to answer those questions in the methods section. Okay, there's going to be sort of 2 parts to the results section. One is just going to be some basic, really displays and summaries of the variables that are in your data set. And then you're going to be looking at possible associations between sets of 2 variables. Okay, and all of that's detailed, in this document. Okay, and we're going to be talking about how to actually look at that visually and how to formally analyze the data to see if these associations are actually there. And so there's a little piece about that. And then sort of a discussion conclusion part that kind of wraps it all up and talks about what it is you actually saw in your data set. Okay, so the rubric, like I said, every assignment in the course has a rubric. Here's an example of the rubric for the project. So in the introduction, for example, the introduction is 10% of your grade, and we give you the different categories here that get you either exemplary, satisfactory, needs improvement, or not evident. Okay, so just pay very close attention to those rubrics, make sure that you're adhering to them, and you should be just fine.